Hello, welcome to Top Class with me, Duncan Crawford, where we're discussing the brand new OECD Survey of Adult Skills. The survey assesses how well adults can read and understand text, work with numbers, and solve complex problems. 31 countries and economies took part in total, including 27 who participated a decade ago. So we have a pretty good idea of where adults are performing well and where they are underperforming. Overall, the results are a mixed bag. It shows that adult literacy proficiency has stagnated or declined in most places. Only Finland and Denmark saw significant improvements in adult reading comprehension. But adults performed better in the numeracy proficiency test, with 8 countries seeing their average scores improve. To unpack all the data and findings from the report, I'm joined by the OECD's Director for Education and Skills, Andreas Schleicher. Thank you for joining me, Andreas.
Thanks for hosting me.
First off, I mentioned some of the key findings there, but this really is a huge report in scale and in ambition. So please give us some of your main impressions about the findings.
This is the largest exercise that was ever done to assess what adults know and can do directly. We do that every 10 years because it is complex. It involves lots of adults. But it is also important. It conveys a very important message, namely that what people know and can do really matters. You can see close link with the wages. You can see a close link with employment. You can see a close link with many social outcomes. And in that context, it's quite, striking that we haven't seen improvements. The world is fundamentally changed over the last decade, requiring people to be much more, nuanced with information, being able to navigate complex information, distinguishing fact from opinion. And you look at the skill set of people and we see as a tendency more declines than improvement on adult skills. So that is something I think the world needs to take notice of.
You say there's been many declines in lots of countries and economies, but where are people doing well or better than elsewhere?
Yeah, there are some very encouraging countries. You can look at Finland and Denmark, where results were good in the past and continue to improve. Not by that much so, but at least marginally. You have some countries where we at least see improvement in the young population, which shows there's something happening in education. When you look at numeracy, overall, we see more improvements there. So numeracy is something that is also very, very important in the societies we are. But, that is clearly the minority of countries. We see a few good examples. In the majority, it is stagnation or performance really dropping.
And to make it clear to those listening, what can the most skilled adults do if they are highly literate, for example, compared to those who do poorly in these tests?
Yeah, at the top end of the distribution, you can, link different information sources. You can navigate complex texts. You can distinguish fact from opinion. And those things that you would hope every adult could do, but it's actually a relatively small share of people who are confident in those kinds of tasks and good at them.
I should have mentioned at the start to anyone who wants to see all the scores, all the country-specific data, then go to the OECD website and search for the Survey of Adult Skills. Loads of data and charts to get your teeth into. And also you can check out the Insights and Interpretations brochure, which sums up the main findings of the report too. Now, though, to come back to the questions, if I continue to concentrate on literacy, really, where, a lot of countries didn't have great results. So should policymakers be concerned?
When I went to school, literacy was simple. It was about reading linear texts. When I didn't know the answer, I could look it up in an encyclopedia and I could trust the answer to be true. Literacy was really about processing, studying information. Today, when you look up things on Google or ChatGPT, you get 100 answers to your question and nobody's going to tell you what's right and what's wrong, what's true and what is not true. Literacy has become a very different construct. It really requires people to construct knowledge, not just extract it. And compared with that, the results that we see show that a very large share of the adult workforce is not ready for that. They're still, in the processing stage. You know, the literacy skills are still very basic. Really, they are good enough to, just read a, pre-prepared text, but not good enough to navigate the kind of knowledge and information sources that you'd like people to be confident with. No?
To single out Finland for a moment, Finnish adults who completed high school often outperformed adults in the survey in other countries, even if they had a university education. So in fact, in Finland, adults who left education after completing high school outscored most adults, including those with a uni education, in 19 out of 31 countries and economies. What is Finland doing right that other countries could potentially emulate with their adult population?
Yeah, I think the first, conclusion from that finding is that we should look more at what people know and can actually do rather than just the certificates that they've got. As you say, high school degree in one country may result in similar skill profiles as a university degree in another. So, we should look less at certificates and look more at what people can actually do. But the second conclusion is that literacy is something that we build early in people's lives. That those foundations are laid pretty early on, and we actually see relatively modest improvements of literacy skills once people have left the education system. So what Finland does well, it equips people at early ages with a very solid information and with a very, very solid set of skills, and also with the motivation to engage in proactive reading behaviors, because that's also something which the survey shows, that people who do read, who engage with reading, or motivated readers, are significantly better in outcomes. So Finland is an example. Those foundations are there, and then adults have, a lot of energy to proceed when they are at the workplace.
So is that something which policymakers in certain countries should be considering, more focus on developing skills like literacy in early childhood education and care settings, for example?
Early childhood education care is perhaps where you can, create the curiosity and the right learning strategies. I do think, literacy is probably still best learned at the age of schooling. That's at least what neuroscience would tell you about that. But, in school, in primary school and maybe secondary school, we can do a lot to make sure that people leave school with those kinds of foundations. What is very clear is people who lack literacy skills have a very hard life today. I mean, you can't even buy a bus ticket in some countries.
Much of the drop in skills is concentrated among people who have minimum levels of education. How concerning is that, and what can be done to try to change that situation?
Yeah, I mean, that's not so surprising. Those who have not benefited from great schooling, who dropped out early, had fewer opportunities to study, to learn. And the message from that is that we need to do more to ensure that we, identify people who fall behind very early on in their lives and intervene inverse in proportion to success to ensure that we attract, the most talented teachers into the classes where students struggle most, that we align resources with needs, that, for example, we give students with an immigrant background really good language support early on in their lives so that they have a chance to, catch up in other fields of study. Now, that's another message from the survey, that in not in all, but in many countries, those with an immigrant background really struggle on this test. No?
And would you say a part of that is due to language issues?
Yeah, I mean, naturally, if you come into a country where you don't speak the language, you will have a harder time in literacy. But what we see, that this is often still visible in the second generation. In the first generation, you can understand it. You come from another country into a country and you have to learn the language and so on. But in the second generation, you would hope that society has addressed that. Giving those, children from migrant families particular support, language support, so that they get a solid foundation. But as you can see from this data, often even the second generation of migrants lacks important foundations, and that's something that we need to take to heart.
There were some large falls in adult literacy in certain countries, and I wonder if there are any clues as to why adult skills have dropped so sharply in some places compared to others?
Well, it's hard to say. We see the result. We would need to follow people individually to understand the causes behind those drops in outcomes. And that's not something that's been possible. But when you look at the overall decline in literacy and you say, we see drops in literacy, less in numeracy, some of that may simply be a reflection on reading behavior of adults today. If you think how you read 10 years, 15 years ago, we did read more complex articles. We read longer books. We engaged with much more sophisticated reading material than we do often today, where we read little snippets of information. Those things may play out in the skills of people, or even in their motivation to engage with reading. That's very hard to prove. We just see the result here, but it's certainly something going on. Otherwise, we wouldn't see that drop in so many countries.
When you look at the modern world now, the amount of misinformation, fake news, and increasingly fabricated AI content, how dangerous is it for adults to have poorer skills, to decipher that information, to critically assess information?
Well, you see, in the past, it was certainly much easier to get by with poor literacy skills. Once again, we had people-intensive service industries. You could always ask someone. You could always get advice. You could get a job without having very sophisticated kind of literacy skills. And that is getting harder. The space that people with poor skills have in our economies, our societies, is getting narrower. And we can see that on the economic side. You can see clear, wage disadvantage for people with poor literacy skills. You can see an employment disadvantage. But those things, society can deal with the redistribution. You can, always, give people the economic means. If they don't have, enough economic opportunity, you can, take money from the rich, give it to the poor. Those redistribution works on the economic side. It doesn't work on the social and on the civic side. If people can't access the knowledge of the world, if they get, misled by misleading information, then, suddenly the polarization on the skills distribution translates into a polarized society, a polarized democracy, a polarized economy. And those are the kind of civic and social consequences may ultimately be more severe than simply inequality and economic outcomes. But it is very clear that people with poor literacy skills these days have a hard time to follow what's going on in the world. Again, you need a fair amount of literacy nowadays to buy a bus ticket or a flight ticket on the internet, or to read the fine print on the conditions and all of that. That should be a worrying sign. The more advanced our economies, our societies become, the more demands are placed on people to either to become, naive consumers of prefabricated content. You can just, take whatever ChatGPT gives you. For that, probably you need lower levels of literacy. But if you want to question that knowledge, if you want to, triangulate, if you look, contrast, critique, and evaluate, you need a fair amount of critical thinking. And critical thinking is based on advanced literacy skills.
In contrast to literacy, to focus on adult numeracy skills for a moment, they're doing okay overall in comparison. What's your interpretation of the findings?
Well, it depends what you call okay. If you look at what adults actually struggle with on the numeracy scale, there's sometimes really basic tasks. You can see, a good share in some countries, the majority of adults have difficulties solving pretty everyday kind of numeracy tasks and doing a calculating a percentage. So I don't think you can say numeracy skills are good compared with the demands. What is true is that we have seen, more improvement on numeracy compared with what we've seen a decade ago, particularly in countries, England was an example where, it was actually surprising. Young adults compared, you could say, a decade ago when we did that survey the first time in numeracy, young people moving into the labor market were not better skilled than people moving into retirement. And there we have seen improvement. In the UK, you can see young people have at least slightly better numeracy skills. So there's an improvement. But I would still say, again, compared with the demands, if you do not understand the idea of an exponential function, you have a very hard time to follow what's happening on climate change or, the evolution of a pandemic. So once again, the demands placed on people are rising, and compared with that, I would say we have still a major challenge on the numeracy front.
With all the changes happening to societies, new technologies and AI in particular, does that make numeracy skills more or less important?
Yeah, it's a good question. It certainly, for the population, that gets into engineering, science, and so on, advanced numeracy skills always remain critically important. For a large part of the population, you can say, well, I have my calculator or numbers are given to me. I don't need to have advanced numeracy skills. But I would argue again, you become a consumer of, prefabricated knowledge. If you want to question information, if you want to understand, complex scientific phenomena, the degree of numeracy skills that is required for that is actually pretty demanding. And you can really see that good shares of our population are not prepared for that.
8 countries saw their average scores improve, Finland and Singapore recording the largest gains. I know it's probably difficult to say, but is there something those countries are doing right to support numeracy skills that others could learn from?
What is striking in Singapore in particular is that the young population is doing really well. And you can see that on our PISA assessment as well. Singapore tops the world in mathematics. And that is simply because that has been a priority. That country has understood that mathematics and numeracy is actually the best predictor for most economic and social outcomes in life. No? Even better than literacy. Numeracy is predicting those outcomes better. So I think countries that invest in numeracy make one of the best investments in the future. Singapore has always done that. So the young population in Singapore comes out very well. There's still a long trail of older workers who did not benefit from that kind of education in Singapore, and that's where the large intergenerational gap comes from. That's a different story from Finland, but in Singapore, that's really still quite visible. It's a recent success in education, but it's clearly a country that has taken that to heart, that wants to give everybody an excellent kind of foundation and is succeeding with that.
I want to talk to you about divides. There are various divides which become apparent from this data. One of them is the gender gap, where one of the notable findings of the survey is the decline in literacy proficiency for adult men. And it shows that in the past decade, literary skills have dropped far more among men than women. So actually the gender gap has reduced. What do you think about that?
Well, we see a large gender gap already early on in literacy. Girls on PISA actually show a much greater advantage than what you see on the survey of adult skills. So in some way, you could argue that actually the gender gap is larger for younger children than it is for adults later on. So there's something in our societies that maybe the way people use their skills that gives men an advantage. But you're quite right that if you look at this over time, the advantage of men is dropping. No? And we do not know to what extent that is attributable to the work you do or your reading behavior at home and so on. But it's clearly a noticeable trend. But overall, we see a better gender balance among people at working age than in reading than at school.
Yeah, one aspect of this is that even though women's skills are now the same or better than men for literacy in many places, separately, they're not getting better pay packets necessarily. There's still this gender pay gap. And why is it that year after year, even though people keep talking about the gender pay gap, why does it not come down? Why does it not shrink more so that pay gap disappears?
Yeah, there are many factors driving that, but some are really hard to change, and they have to do with the career choices that people make. When you see, for example, the share of women going into computing, science, and technology is actually dropped rather than increased. So gender difference in career choices in some cases have been risen, and they drive, if you study digital science as opposed to anthropology, you're going to get a different outcome even if you have great literacy skills. So I think to some extent, career and study choices are a driver. They are hard. That's hard to address, but there are also certain, lots of inequalities in labor markets, and that's something that countries need to act on.
Speaking of divides, there's this growing skills divide, the survey shows, where the skills of the lowest educated are dropping at a faster rate than the most educated adults. Mm-hmm. Any clues as to why this is the case and what policymakers can do to try and change that situation?
You see, that's one of the largest concerns that I would have from this data, is that we see that growing skills gap, the decline of the skills among the lowest educated, the lowest skills people, because that increases the polarization of skills, and polarization in skills translates into economic polarization, social polarization, cultural polarization. We really need to take that to heart. And what the data show, it's very difficult to fix later on in people's lives. Most of the training that people get after school reinforces initial skill differentials. So those who have, a university degree, advanced skills, they're going to continue to learn. They benefit from lots of kind of training opportunities, whereas those who did not get the foundations early on benefit the least. So in a way, what happens after school tends to reinforce that gap. So the message from that is we need to do much better in making sure that every young adult, whenever they leave education, really have those foundations, not just the skills, but also the motivation, the learning strategies to expand their horizon. That's really, I think, what public policy can deliver, because we see that some countries are very good at that. The other part of the equation, how do we provide, better opportunities for people to acquire skills at work, in life later on? That's harder to address, but I also think in a modern society, we need to come better on this. We used to learn to do the work, and now learning is the work. That's the big transition in which we are. We need to, good places of work are great places of learning, and good places of learning these days are good places of work. And I think that's a message. We would have liked to see more of that happening in the last 10 years. And perhaps, to me, the biggest surprise of these new results was that this narrative of lifelong, life-wide learning hasn't really taken hold in most countries now.
Why do you think that is?
The biggest barriers, are we ourselves. When we ask adults, why didn't you go to study? Why don't you continue to learn? People say, I don't need it. So, if you are a truck driver today, and your car gets automated tomorrow, that today you need to, move on, advance your, broaden your horizon. That awareness is still very limited. Our societies have not been very good to convey that message to people. The second part is, if you didn't have a great experience in school, people don't want to go back to that kind of learning. We need to give people greater ownership over what they learn and how they learn and where they learn and when in their lives they learn. We still have a very school-based model of adult learning. We send people to courses rather than, equipping them with the tools. And that's, I think, something where, we should be doing a lot better. But the third element is also important. At your workplace, you still get largely recognized for very lumpy degrees and qualification. You got a college degree, we'll pay you better. We need to become much more nuanced in recognizing smaller increments of skills, so that when you upskill and reskill, you get rewarded for this. If our economies make the threshold too high, if I tell you you got to do a PhD to get more money, then most people will say that's not for me. If you can tell people, look, you apply your skills from the brown economy as an engineer to the green economy, and we're going to reward you for that. That granularity in degrees and qualification, micro credentials and so on, I think that's, in a way, the quick win. Last element is you take, countries that are pretty good at this today, take the example of Sweden. Employers need to be also, perhaps make it easier for workers to combine learning and working than we currently do. I think if you take those four elements together, we could be doing better, but it's clear that the narrative is still very far away from the reality.
From some of the points you just made there, one of the questions that's raised from the survey that I found interesting is the data lends itself to the idea, the criticism of education systems, that qualifications aren't always that useful for many employers. What are your thoughts on the findings on wages, for example?
Well, that's actually an interesting outcome, that the data show that qualifications are still far more important on earnings than skills in addition to qualifications. So labor markets are still very much focused on the degrees that people got. They pay you for the paper. Probably what you would hope is that labor markets over time will become more nuanced, that they become better at recognizing what people know and actually can do rather than just on where they studied or what degree they had obtained. But the reality is, as of today, the degrees, formal qualifications have a much greater impact on earning outcomes than the additional value from the skills of people. That is also, in some ways, a surprising finding. No?
Yeah, the data show that adults who work in jobs that don't require their level of education receive 13% lower wages compared to peers who are in well-matched jobs. What's your view on this? Are there too many qualifications which aren't that useful in the labour market?
Yes, but there are also too many qualifications that are not great signals of the skills people actually have. I would actually argue that many jobs are actually quite good in matching the skills to the jobs. And employers find out when your qualification isn't actually mirrored in the skills you've got. So you don't get the wage despite the paper certificates. I would read this skill mismatch as a sign that, maybe labor markets are better in figuring out what you know and can actually do. But the other part of this is that, if you get a qualification in an area that is not very valuable, you may have to put up with a lower salary. Again, you may end up with a job that where you are formally overqualified because your qualification isn't reflected in the skills you actually need and have for the specific job.
Do these kinds of conversations happen with students routinely to outline what's going to happen over the coming decades in terms of their salaries and things due to the courses they're choosing? Because if a student is passionate about studying a certain subject, surely they should be able to pursue it. But if, like you say, it's potentially going to mean that they are, have considerable economic uncertainty or issues over the lifetime, is that something which should be highlighted to them?
Absolutely. We need to become better at telling young people the truth. I think our education systems are often not very good. We market things that are often easy to teach rather than giving young people a good sense of the social economic value of what they study. Personally, I'm a big proponent of a dual degree. I believe, everybody should be studying two things. One's where you have a real passion, something that interests you, where you want to make a difference in the world, whatever its economic value. And then, you study something else where this is going to get me a good, salary. And then maybe sometimes in life you find the combination where you can actually live your passion but still do something economically meaningful. If you just pursue a study out of interest without having something in your hands where you can actually convert better skills into a good job and a good life, you're going to face a hard time. If you just study, this is where the labor market outcomes are probably good, but it doesn't interest me, you may get a job, but the world may change. You may not be motivated. So I think we need to give, people a little bit more leeway in combining their passion with something that, makes sense. But to do that, we need to give young people much better career guidance. We need to give them much better insights, a capacity to anticipate the evolution of labor demands as well. I think we have much better information than what we give to young people. Most of the information about career guidance is given to people by people who come from the education sector or psychology, but not necessarily from, the kind of occupations where you want to convey that passion to young people.
Yeah, they obviously don't represent the population of the world, but friends of mine who are struggling actors and artists might disagree with you on the need for them to do maths, for example, or something.
Well, I think, if you have a passion for the arts, I think pursue it. But, at the same time, also learn something where you can be pretty confident that you can use it. And maybe it will be the intersection between math and the arts that makes you incredibly successful.
The survey shows also that adults with high literacy and numeracy skills are often considerably more likely to feel they can understand and influence political affairs. In Switzerland in particular, the scores are very high. But in some places, the trend is reversed, where the more educated are less politically engaged. What's going on with the findings there with this data?
Well, on balance, you still find a lot more places where actually skills are positively related to civic engagement. And that's a good thing. It really shows that, if you have the skills, you can make a difference, and you have the perception, you can make a difference. But, clearly when you live in Switzerland, it's a society that actually gives people a real say in most affairs. You go to vote, you go to actually shape what happens in your community, in your country. So absolutely, people know that. I have got the skills, I can do this, I can change the world. In other countries, highly educated people may have become disillusioned. They may not feel that, civic engagement, political efficacy, and we should worry about it. That again may be a bigger threat to our future than just the economic divide, that people feel a sense of disempowerment, a sense of, civic disengagement. But I would look at it in a positive way. Where people've got the skills, in general, they're much more inclined to see themselves as actors of political processes rather than as objects of them.
Yeah, I have the results here. So Switzerland, followed by Czechia, Japan, Sweden and Finland are where highly educated adults feel the most politically engaged. The data also shows, or suggests, I should say, that skilled adults report being happier and healthier. So skills as well. It's not just about finding a job. It's potentially being happier in life and healthier overall.
Absolutely. And again, it's not so hard to understand. When you have skills, you have just so many more opportunities in life. But probably also on the health side, the unhealthy jobs are probably more likely to go to people without great skills. So poorly skilled people end up in the jobs that are less healthy. That could be, the other side of that picture. But overall, you would expect people who have better skills to have more agency. And agency typically leads to greater satisfaction with your life, with your job, with anything.
Thank you so much, Andreas. I know we could talk for hours and hours about this, but that is all we've got time for. That is Andreas Schleicher, the OECD's Director for Education and Skills. Thank you so much for joining us. If you want to learn more about the survey of adult skills, then please go to the OECD website where you will find the report. It is packed full with country-specific data and detail. And, this podcast has barely scratched the surface, to be honest. So please do check it out and subscribe to this podcast as well so you don't miss any future episode. That's it for now, though. I'll be back with another episode of Top Class soon. All the best.